Hello, Caldwell History. Hello, U.S. History 2. This is Nathan Giesenschlag, your professor. And I have another installment of U.S. History via YouTube for you. As we left off today in class, we talked about the Spanish-American War. And as John Hay so poignantly put it, this splendid little war brought great low-hanging fruit to the United States. We pick up nice territories in Puerto Rico. We pick up nice territories in Guam and in the Philippines and so forth, some of which we hold on to a while. We hold on to Cuba for a bit of time. And then we turn them loose. So we have this is the burgeoning American empire, and the phrase used to describe people who were in favor of empire at this time period are called jingoist. A jingoist is a person who wants to see the United States in and around the year 1900 expand. Theodore Roosevelt would be one of those individuals. And as I bring up Theodore Roosevelt here, by the way, I'll save the Philippine barbecue when I get to class. If you ask me to remind me to tell you that story, I will. It has everything to do with the insurrection, which, by the way, that Philippine insurrection was a brutal affair. So anyways, long and the short of it is that the United States in or about the year 1901 is going to be undergoing the metamorphosis of that economic behemoth that we've talked about in class to becoming a superpower itself. The United States in or about the year 1901 is going to see the rise of a new leader and a new way of doing government and business. And in a sense, what we're going to do here is we're going to pivot on out of the 19th century and leave that behind finally and move into the 20th century and see how far we get. So that brings us up to an important man, and that is Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt. His background's quite unique and interesting, some of which you've already read and studied and thought about, of course, some of which I'll tell you and you'll find out more about in due time. Today. But when it comes to old Roosevelt, in the aftermath of the war with Spain, Roosevelt in 1898 is going to come home a hero, a Rough Rider hero. He was already a known political figure in the state of New York who had grand ambitions. But when it comes to Roosevelt in 98, he decides there's no time like the present, especially when you're as popular as he was. He decides to run for governor of New York. And in New York, every 2 years is a governor's election. So, I mean, it's his opportunity. Now, Roosevelt is about 41 years old, maybe 40 even. I'd have to go back and do the math on that. Maybe 41. No, I'll take that back. Let me think a second here. 59, he would have been about 39, 40, about my age, a hair older. But he had already developed a reputation as a bit of a loose cannon and a bit of a wild man, though very popular and at times very much a Republican of the first order. So I guess you probably ought to write down the fact that he is a Republican in New York State. And so he runs for governor in 1898. The Republican establishment was not particularly fond of him running, but they also know a winner when they see one, and Roosevelt was a winner because of his hero status. It's not the first time a governor will run for a war hero will run for the governorship or the presidency, as you well know, and get it. The man Roosevelt has to deal with is a fellow named Platt, Platt. Should have looked this up before I sat down and lectured it. Oh gosh, they always called him Boss Platt, or I want to say it's David, but that's not right. But anyways, Boss Platt, Platt, is the kind of the boss of New York State politics, especially Republican politics. And Roosevelt and Platt sit down and they come to an agreement as to if Roosevelt gets elected, that he'll work with the machine. That's kind of a slang term for the era. The machine is the political machine that gets people elected and has their candidates and all that sort of thing. And Roosevelt said he would take their consideration and advice, and they worked out an agreement. So the Republicans back Roosevelt. Roosevelt runs in 1898 as a war hero, as a reformer, as a few other things, and he wins the governorship in 1898. The problem is that Roosevelt isn't exactly a man who can be maneuvered very well. He's his own man. He's very much independent. He's very vigorous and forceful. In 1898, or 99 rather, Roosevelt causes some consternation in New York State politics by pushing for reform. Understand, New York State politics are pretty dirty. I didn't talk about it in class, but the Democratic mayor of New York City in the 1860s and 70s was called Boss Tweed, or oh gosh, now I'm having a senior moment. I guess I'm forgetting all these names. Tweed's correct. Everybody just called him Boss Tweed, but oh well, you can look him up. He's one of the characters that that. Well, boy, this is not good when you're sitting here recording and what have you and everything. He's one of the characters that Thomas Nast goes after in his political cartoons. Boss Tweed ran New York City politics lock, stock, and barrel, and New York politics, whether it's city politics or state politics, New York politics is crooked as a barrel full of snakes. And so Roosevelt, by introducing some reforms or attempting to bring in reform, upsets the Republican establishment in 1899, and they're looking for a way to get rid of him. So Boss Platt and the Republican establishment cast about into 1900. 1900, as you know, just by doing simple math and knowing your political calendar, 1900 is another election year. William McKinley is the war president, and he won the war in 1900, or won the war in 1898. Now 1900, he's running for another term. McKinley is going to run against old William Jennings Bryan. And this is the second of those 3 times that Bryan runs. This time he's going to get beat worse. But, you know, hindsight, I guess, is 2020. You could say that it was a foregone conclusion that Bryan was going to lose and that McKinley, the war president, was going to win and the hero and all that sort of business. But the Republicans don't have omniscience. They don't have good and perfect vision like the Almighty does. But they got to make sure they're trying to feather the nest. They want to win. That's what most political parties really relish, is winning. And so it also helped the Republicans in New York State out if Roosevelt was put onto the Republican ticket of 1900. So Roosevelt was induced. In fact, he was basically strong-armed, tied to a chair and drug into the Republican convention in 1900 to be the vice presidential candidate for William McKinley. And it's a good deal. Roosevelt runs and supports McKinley and gives great speeches and all those sorts of things there. And Roosevelt helps McKinley out. It was not that close of an election. McKinley probably wins anyways. But now that Roosevelt is vice president of the United States, well, that's for the Republicans of New York State. They were happy as clams. And the reason they were happy as clams at high tide was because they figured that they had buried Roosevelt's political career. Know this, being vice president in 1900 or 1901 is no great thing. I mean, it's a great thing if something goes right for you, and it has to be the thing that goes right for you. But for the most part, going to the vice presidency in the 19th and early part of the 20th century was a kiss of death politically, and most people figured that Roosevelt had been buried in the vice presidency, and there he lay. But one man, Marcus Hanna, a.k.a. Mark Hanna, sometimes you'll see it like that, but Marcus Hanna, Hanna, Mark Hanna is going to be one of the more perceptive types in the room who says, oh my gosh, don't you realize that there's only one heartbeat in between that madman, Roosevelt, and the presidency? And of course, that one heartbeat is McKinley. And the first vice president of the United States, John Adams, said it so well when he said, I am nothing, but I might be everything. And that is always, in a sense, the hope of the vice president and the understanding of the vice president. I am nothing, but I might be everything. You're everything if the president resigns or more likely dies. And so for Roosevelt, that's his only hope. But he figures he's done. He figures he's politically dead in the water. But fate, or really said correctly, an assassin intervenes. An assassin intervenes in the affairs of American history. And that man's name, that assassin's name is Leon Cholkosh. You could look him up, but it starts out Czgolszcz, I think. Cholkosh, Leon Cholkosh. Now, Cholkosh is an American citizen. Now, he comes from, as I recall, Polish extraction. His family were immigrants in the Great Migrative Wave of the 1870s. But he's a thoroughgoing American citizen. However, he never assimilated into the larger culture. He looked around and he was what you called at the time period an anarchist. He's an anarchist. I would say it like this. Wikipedia does a good job of kind of saying who Khosh is. So if you wanted to go look him up that way, I don't blame you one iota. Now, Khosh is not a deranged man like old Charles Guiteau was. Kosh knew what he was up to, knew what he was doing, and he wanted to kill the president, to strike a blow for the anarchist movement. And remember this, it's not just the United States that deals with anarchism. In and or about the year 1900, say 20 years on either side of it, particularly on the front side of 1900, there are more than a few anarchists running around Europe who are lobbing bombs and using pistols to cause terror and upset and fear within the hearts of polite and elite European society. And in a sense, some of the stuff you talk about today in the news with the terrorism of Islam is not terribly different in practice than that of the anarchists and the Marxists and those boys. Now, admittedly, though, there is one. Should say this. Perhaps it's more than a significant difference. The Islamists, the Islamic terrorists who do what they do, they normally bomb large areas. They bomb indiscriminately and try to kill as many people as they can. A lot of these anarchists, though they may lob bombs in meetings and such like that, and that does happen, they seem to have, they really relish the assassination, and what I mean by that is going after the powerful and elite of a society, a country, etc. Khosh is of that idea. In the early fall of 1901, President McKinley is going to go to the Buffalo World's Fair, the Buffalo Exposition, and while he's there, he's going to see the sights, see the great lights, see this, see that. It's a major event. Sorry, I hope you don't mind if I lean back and talk a little bit as well. It's kind of like me sitting down and lecturing. Sometimes I do that. So it was just common knowledge. And in 1901, McKinley, by the way, is protected. He's protected by the embryonic form of the Secret Service. It's very basic and very new, but they're trying to protect him. It's not quite as willy-nilly as it was in 1881 with old James Garfield. Khosh knows that McKinley is going to be there. And Khosh knew what he was up to and knew what he wanted. But the problem with these assassins that you read about in this time period is some of them are very, very, well, they're ill-prepared. You go to do that. You go to do that sort of a graphic deed, that horrible deed of assassinating the president. You probably ought to take a better gun. But the assassin, Khosh, he took a cheap piece of junk 32 caliber revolver. I mean, it's a cheap piece of junk. That thing didn't hardly fire right. It was when I say cheap, it was like $2 sort of cheap. Understand there's a little inflation since then. But the fact of the matter is it was a cheap gun, and Khosh is going to go kill the president with a cheap gun. So, McKinley, on the day of the assassination, McKinley is standing in a receiving line in a room at the Buffalo Exposition. By the way, Vice President Roosevelt is up in the Adirondacks of upstate New York, a ways away. Not anywhere close, not going to be going there or what have you. He's pretty much out of the deal. He's not, he's on vacation, actually, to say that correctly. So McKinley's receiving people, and it's a handshaking. And I don't know if you've ever been in a political receiving line where you're the one going through the line and shaking the politician's hand. Normally what happens is they reach out for your hand, and especially a receiving line, shake, shake, shake. Roosevelt was really good at this, in fact, but so was McKinley. All of them are good at this time period. But he grabs your hand, and in a sense, he pulls you with his hand and pulls you through the line, and he's asking you just like, how are you doing? How's your mother, if he knew you, that sort of thing. Are you okay? Glad to see you. Thank you for being here. Da-da-da. And it's the same sort of thing. Grip and grab, grip and pull. And so a line of people who obviously would love to meet the president, and many of them just regular folk who had just been there to watch been there to the exposition and happened to be there on the same day the president was there, got in the line to meet the president. At the opening of this room, there at the doorway to this room was a Secret Service agent watching the folks come through. There was another fellow staying fairly close to the president, but not right on top of him or anything. Somebody else who's in the room you might find interesting is Robert Todd Lincoln. Robert Todd Lincoln. Now, I'll be honest with you, if Robert Todd Lincoln was, and I'm president, and Robert Todd was in this room with me, I'd probably jump out a window. Because every time you turn around, he seems to be meeting presidents and they're dying left and right. He met briefly a few days before Garfield. Of course, he's the son of Lincoln, etc., and so forth. He was there when Lincoln got shot, etc. I understand this, and I'm not saying some sort of conspiracy. I don't believe that. It seemed like Robert Todd Lincoln was an unlucky charm, if there is such a thing. So Robert Todd was in the room with Robert Todd Lincoln was in the room with old McKinley. I should say this more. Robert Todd Lincoln isn't just the ex-president's son, the ex-great President Lincoln's son. Robert Todd Lincoln had been a big mover and shaker in Republican politics, and there had actually been a push to get him elected president and draft him to run for president in about the 1884 or so. Robert Todd was smart enough to know that he didn't want the job. He'd seen what it did to his daddy and all that could go wrong with it, and so he decided, no, that's not for me. So Robert Todd's in the room, the line's going through, and Khosh jumps in, and he's acting nondescript. What Khosh did was he took the pistol in his hand, and then before he got there, he wrapped his hand in a bandage. As if his hand was a mangled hand. Perhaps he got it caught up in a buggy accident or something, or got yanked half to pieces, and he didn't want anybody to see it. Which, quite honestly, it's not common, but it's not unheard of to say just to have a gloved hand or a wrapped hand so no one will have to look at that ugly thing hanging off your arm. So people saw it, obviously noticed it, but no one said, hey, you better stop. Well, as Khosh started to go through the line, the Secret Service agent saw him, and Khosh made a little eye contact, nothing out of the ordinary, didn't look particularly nervous. And the agent saw it, thought it odd, but decided to let it go. Again, the agency at this point in time is fairly new. It's not exactly well-trained or anything like that, what have you. So they let it go, and Khosh comes up to the president, and McKinley evidently said something to the effect about, how'd you hurt your hand, to change up to how you doing, how'd you hurt your hand, and he reaches for the other hand. Basically, it's a replay, just a slight difference of what he'd been doing for the last 30 minutes or so, McKinley, that is. Well, Khosh saw his opportunity, and he pulled the trigger on that piece of junk 32 caliber pistol, and the gun went off, and it won because it was a cheap gun, and two, because it had black powder. It caught the bandage on fire. And two, more spectacularly, the bullet goes out. And the bullet, you can see this right here, this button. Just imagine the bullet goes out, hits the button, and goes bing! Ricochets off a button. Now, I don't know about you, but maybe they make buttons better back in 1898 and 1901 than they do in 2016. But whatever reason, the bullet was that weak, it was that bad of a gun, all the factors, that bullet goes in, hits the button and ricochets, and off it goes. Immediately, people spring into action. People around him start to jump on Khosh, and he swings wildly back for a second shot. This time, the gun goes off again, and this time the shot is true, and it drills and hits the president square in the chest. Actually, the upper abdomen, about right here. You can't see it, but just below the breastbone and above the navel sort of territory. And so the president is wounded, and he goes into shock, obviously. That's normally what happens next medically. Khosh is drug off and whipped up on and that sort of thing. The rest of the story goes like this. Khosh is going to be tried for murder, assassination, and he will be electrocuted very quickly, meaning months, just mere months after the assassination by the state of New York. Back then, it wasn't a federal crime to kill the president. It was just assumed to be a state crime wherever it took place at. So they executed through electrocution Khosh. But when the president, McKinley, goes down with his bullet wound, they carry him off to a hotel. They carry him off to a hospital there in Buffalo, New York. It's the middle of the afternoon. Not much is going on. This is not like today where hospitals are just filled to overflowing, and it's always kind of a beehive and a den of activity. But this hospital in Buffalo was very quiet, bland, etc. And so There was only one doctor on call that afternoon who was around the hospital, and when they bring the president in, the president's personal physician's not there. And thankfully, this is not a replay of 1881 with old McKinley, with old Garfield. The doctor on call, however, you would rather want somebody else's fellow who's going to work on the president, but this doctor is a gynecologist. This is a gynecologist as a doctor, and he's got to save the president's life. If you're McKinley, you got to be thinking, oh boy, here we go. But to be honest about it, the doctor, this man who works on McKinley, does an honest job and a good job. He judges the situation. I believe he took an x-ray or two, which was very new at that time period. He knew about sepsis. He knew about infection and disease and all that sort of stuff. Much better doctors than just 20 years before when Garfield had been shot up and really the malpractice had gone on. And so McKinley's, this gynecologist looks at it and does what's appropriate for the medicine of the time period. Today, quite honestly, McKinley probably survives. Back then, it didn't happen because they sewed him up with the bullet still in because they understood they couldn't get it out. It was that buried that deep, and it would be better just to sew him up and hope it worked out. Well, they'd obviously called the vice president in and said, be prepared to take the oath of office if the president dies. Well, the first few days after the shooting, McKinley rallied, and most people thought McKinley was fine. He's going to survive. He's going to be okay. Well, the problem was that the second, about the fourth day, the fifth day, infection set in with that wound, and I believe it was about 8 days after the shooting, McKinley himself dies of infection. It wasn't the gunshot wound directly; it was the infection caused by the gunshot wound. So the president is dead. The vice president now ascends to the presidency. Roosevelt, that madman, is now the president of the United States. And those who saw him that day, the first day he was president of the United States, said he could barely contain himself, that he had been emancipated from the vice presidency, and even under bad circumstances, Roosevelt himself said it was yeah, I didn't want it this way, but it's no reason to be morbid over it. And so he didn't wallow in self-pity. He was pretty happy that he was now president. It was now his opportunity to do more. So Roosevelt is president of the United States. Theodore Roosevelt is the youngest man ever to assume the presidency, to take the presidency. Jack Kennedy, or John F. Kennedy, was the youngest man to be elected. Roosevelt was younger, but because of the assassination, you say it because he assumed the presidency. Theodore Roosevelt's life is very different in a sense. And one of the things you probably ought to just kind of understand and make note of is that you're now seeing a generational shift. You're really, in a sense, you're leaving the Civil War generation behind, at least in the presidency. And no more of those old men who had served in the battlefields of the Civil War and what have you. Roosevelt was far too young to have served in the Civil War. He was only 6 or so when I think he was 6. I'd have to check the exact dates. But Roosevelt saw Lincoln's body get drugged through New York City. Of course, they drug Lincoln's body everywhere to make them vote Republican. I'm sorry to be cynical about that, but it's really kind of what it was to me, anyways, as a historian. So, but Roosevelt saw Lincoln's body, but he was just a boy. And so he knew nothing of the Civil War carnage. And of course, that's part of the reason I'd say he was a worshiper of war. Now, at the same time, I want to say this about Roosevelt directly. He may have been a war hawk when the Spanish-American War got going. But Roosevelt was not a chicken hawk, if you catch what I mean. Roosevelt advocated war, but Roosevelt put his mouth and his rear end in the same place. He said, we need to go to war, and when war came, he quit his assistant secretary of the Navy, a Navy ship, formed up the Rough Riders we talked about earlier in the previous lecture. And now he'd served. He had seen combat. And I want to be explicitly clear to you here is that Roosevelt at San Juan Hill. San Juan Hill is where Roosevelt's fame, he called it his crowded hour, his moment of glory. And it was in a sense. When his Rough Riders go up San Juan Hill, Roosevelt is on the back of one of those horses, one of the few horses that made it into Cuba. And Roosevelt is exposed to withering fire. He is the lead is flying hot and heavy all around him. Many of, not all, not half, but many of his Rough Riders are casualties, whether wounded or killed that day, going up San Juan's Hill and Kettle Hill. Long story short is that Roosevelt was sitting on top of a white horse, or I think it was gray actually, but sitting on top of a horse is an inviting target to somebody who wants to shoot at him. He was not in the rear in a bunker hiding and cowering. He put his life on the line fighting. He knew what combat was. So in that sense, it's always important to remember when Roosevelt is bellicose, when Roosevelt is hitting the drumbeats of war, he'd been there. Now, it's not as those battlefields in Cuba are not obviously nearly as gruesome or graphic as what McKinley saw at Gettysburg and other sorts of places. But the fact is that Roosevelt had put his, he was qualified in that sense. But Roosevelt's life is a rather interesting one. He, in 1302 history, is one of those guys I do spend a little bit of time talking about because politically I think he's very important to the future of the United States. We've been touching on the issue of the changes in the government, a tiny government and now getting ready to become big. And in part of it has to do with the personality and the will of Theodore Roosevelt. His background is from New York City. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. had worked, this is Teddy Roosevelt's father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr. had worked in the Lincoln administration. Theodore Roosevelt's life was a life of privilege. The Roosevelt family was old New York money, old Dutch New York money. So when you talk about old Teddy, and by the way, you never called him Teddy to his face, that was something you did not do. But when you talk about old Theodore Roosevelt, the son, the future president, that man grew up with the proverbial silver spoon in his mouth. He did not grow up a poor boy by any stretch of the imagination. You don't work for the President of the United States like Theodore Sr. did and not have some influence. I mean, you're an important guy. He was assistant secretary to the Secretary of State. You can check me on that, but he'd served in the Lincoln administration. The old man did. Theodore Roosevelt's childhood was a rough one. And it wasn't because of a lack of want. They had all the food he could eat, and he had all the clothing he could wear. But it was a rough one because of the asthma. Now, some of you who are watching this probably have had childhood asthma, and you maybe even had it bad. But unlike today, where you can actually mitigate some of the effects of that childhood asthma, where you can mitigate the effects of the attacks with either inhaler or some sort of medicine or what have you, in 1860 America, 1865 America, when Roosevelt had all those medical problems, those attacks when he was just a newborn baby and just about like my Caroline, not very old. The problem was that the kid could not get his breath. If you've never had an asthma attack, and I've never had one, I've got good lungs, but my wife has, and some of you know what I'm talking about, is that when you have an attack, it feels like you're suffocating. You can't get your breath. You may even go into panic. Now imagine if you're a 2 or 3 or 8-month-old child who doesn't know, other than the fact is he can't breathe, and he is just heaving for air and just crying wildly. It would be heartbreaking to any parent. Now, it's more impressionable to me now that I've heard a child cry, my own child cry in tears, not just upset tears, but real, oh my gosh, it hurts, and you can't do anything about it situation. But I understand more fully now what Theodore Sr. felt like when he had to do something for his child. There's no masks, there's no Primatene Mist, there's nothing. So what Theodore Sr. did was he took the little boy, and they hitched up their cart, not wagon, but their horse-drawn carriage, and they will go running, sprinting through the streets of New York City. And the father, let's see if I can do. I can't back up this way. What the father will do is he'll hold the child out the window of the carriage and put the child's face into the wind to force, as best he can, force air into the child's lungs. The child is a weakling. That's a gospel truth sort of thing. He is a weakling. His lungs will not allow him to get strong, at least it seems. So what it does as Theodore Roosevelt grows up, It forces upon him the ability or the necessity of entertaining himself. He can't play in the yard as a very young child because he can't. He just physically can't do it with those lungs. And so he reads and he collects and he gets outside, and he may not play in a rough and tumble sort of way, but he gets outside and he collects flowers and he collects plants and he collects animals, and he becomes quite the naturalist, a self-taught naturalist as a kid. He is an avid reader, and that's all the way true his entire life. Uh, the man read thousands upon thousands of books, and I'm not misstating that. I really mean he read thousands of books. When he was in his lifetime, by the way, the man could read not just if I was to ask some of you in this room, because you're Caldwell dual credit, because you're pre-AP, because you're half a dozen other things, I'm going to guess most of you in this who are watching this probably have read in excess of 20 books in your lifetime. Maybe some of you read 100 books in your lifetime. Maybe you read a book at night. Maybe you're that good. But I rather doubt that last statement. But maybe there's one or two of you in that room who are watching this, who have never, or you're just watching it at home, who have not read more than, say, 5 books, maybe 2. Or if you never read a book, boy, that would be just fine by you. Theodore Roosevelt, when he was president of the United States, I'm not talking about when he was in college, but when he was president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt would read between 2 and 3 books a night. He normally retired to his quarters, his White House sleeping quarters at 8 o'clock in the evening, read to 10, 11, or 12, get up early, read some more, come down, and in one case, because he wasn't, when he was president, Theodore Roosevelt was an acknowledged expert on botany, on the flora and the fauna, and for that matter, half a dozen other things. And when Roosevelt was president, this one, I believe, was a botanist? No, I think it was a zoologist, study of animals. But the fact of the matter is, a great a great zoologist, botanist, one of the two, came to see the president. The visitor was a true expert in this field, and he said, "Mr. President, here is a copy of my latest book. I'd love to give this to you, and you read it, and just tell me what you think when you get a chance to read it. Love to hear what your opinion is." So Roosevelt read that night, came down the next morning and said, "Dr. Sir, this is a great book, but here are the flaws, and let me tell you how it was." And he went through the details of it. A brilliant reader, and he could retain, and he had a first-rate memory on that sense. But secondly, he also was a great writer. He wrote at least 100,000 letters prior to his presidency, and at least 100,000, maybe 150,000 more after the presidency. That man, when he wasn't reading, he was writing. He also wrote books, some of which I noticed in your articles about Roosevelt, The Strenuous Life. When you talk about Roosevelt's books, his greatest works were the Naval War of 1812, The Winning of the West, and I think it was 5 or 6 volumes. And he writes not only those 2 books, but other lesser quality books. Naval War of 1812, by the way, he wrote it when he was just graduating from Harvard. He was 21 years old at best. And it was called the definitive work on that war for the next 100 years. So, I mean, it's not like it was just a flash in the pan 10 years. It had legs as far as the quality of scholarship and the quality of writing. He wrote hundreds of journal articles, hundreds of magazine articles, and he kept a diary, a voluminous diary. And thankfully he did. At times you want to choke him because he can have a bit of a pity party in it, kind of like some of those other guys you read of, say, James K. Polk, another president who kept a diary. Sometimes I always have those pity parties. But Roosevelt's diary was a great resource, is a great resource for the historian. So I'm at 34 minutes right now. I'm going to stop because of time constraints on the recording side. However, I'm going to pick back up again and cut about a 30-minute longer video. So you'll get 2 videos, watch them both, and we'll see you soon on the backside. Thank you.